Hello, I'm Arthur Brandwood, and welcome to this April 2019 edition to the Brandwood Biomedical live webinar series. Today I'm joined with our CEO, Bennett, and we're going to talk about how to survive the perfect storm, international harmonization and lessons from Brexit and the MDR. Good morning, Grant.
Hey, Arthur.
So we're going to take a look at what's happening in the different regulatory jurisdictions and how they're all trying to work together, how they're not working together, what's going on, and what that means for you practicing regulatory affairs in a global marketplace. And we'll begin with an old slide. Those of you who've been listening to our webinars for a while will recognize this one. This is a slide I presented for the first time in 2016, where we actually did a webinar called Storm Warning. And we looked at what was likely to be happening over the next few years, both in terms of changes in regulations in Canada, where Canada changed over from the Canadian Medical Device Conformity Assessment Scheme, or CAMDCAS, to be the first jurisdiction to formally require the use of the Medical Device Single Audit Program, or MDSAP, as a part of regulation. So Canada brought in that requirement at the end of 2018. At the same time, the venerable ISO 13485 standard was being revised to produce the 2016 version with a whole lot more regulatory content. The Europeans were just starting on the journey of implementing the medical device regulations and upgrading from the medical device directives, and we'll talk about that in some more detail. We looked at this and we said, well, it's going to get really busy in 2019, and here's the point. You are here. You're right in the middle of the storm right now, and there's an awful lot going on, and not all of it's running smoothly. And so that's what we're going to look at. How do you actually survive all of this, and how do you deal with all of this change? So here's the agenda for this webinar this morning. We're going to talk for about half an hour or so, and then we'll take questions. We always take questions towards the end. So you will have a control panel. As you've logged into Zoom, you should have a little control panel, and one of the icons on the bottom of the control panel is called Q&A. And if you click the Q&A button, you'll find that you can type in a question. We'll receive that question here, and we will take the questions towards the end. So please, if you've got questions, do that. Don't do it through the comments or through the chat button. Do it through the Q&A button, please. We sometimes miss them when they're coming through chat. So we're going to look at these things. We're going to look at Europe and where things are at with the MDR implementation. And for somebody who's an ex-Brit, we're going to look at Brexit and what's happening there and what that means. We will then turn to what's going on in this part of the world, in Australia and the Asia Pacific, and how the jurisdictions around here are recognizing international approvals to streamline the way things are done. And we'll look at the increasing role of MDSAP in that process in some jurisdictions. Then we'll turn to what's going on in the United States and some of the FDA's initiatives on reforming their pre-market regulatory programs, the changes to the 510K program, the changes to quality systems auditing, and a very interesting development with the software as a medical device pilot, which is taking what is really quite a radical approach for that agency. We'll look at that in a little bit of detail. And then we'll ask the question again, how do you survive? And what's all that about, and how we deal with all of this. So that's our agenda. Let's begin with this slide here. Let's begin. This is another old slide, but in 2011, Americans preferred Europe. There was a big debate. This is nearly, 8 years ago. A big debate going on in the United States saying how terrible it was in America. The FDA was awfully slow, and the Europeans had this wonderfully efficient and lean regulatory system. And the result was that of United States manufacturing companies, according to this survey done by Northwestern University, only 4% of US companies were going to the FDA first. About 80% of them initially approached European regulatory bodies, and about 65% of them followed through on that and achieved European approval before they got approval in their home market in the United States. You can go and look at this survey. That link on the screen is live, and when you get the slides, we'll give you the slides at the end of the presentation. You can go and read that. There's some questions about how that survey was done, but the point was, back then, it was seen that Europe was the model of the lean, efficient regulatory system, and the US was slowing everybody down, and everybody loved the way Europeans are doing things.
Just wanted to add to that, Arthur. I mean, discussions that we are seeing more and more of through the travels that I do is that that's already started to shift. The uncertainty in Europe is really making people rethink, not just the US, but into other broader markets as well.
Yeah, we've certainly seen a couple of companies we've dealt with have just given up their CE mark and said, we'll come back when it's all settled down in a few years' time. They've got a CE mark and they're not bothering to recertify because it's all too hard, which is quite amazing, but that's what's going on. But then Europe changed. So with the PIP breast implant scandal, where there was a regulatory fraud conducted with substitution of materials and failure to comply with quality systems requirements, and then with a number of high-profile failures of implants, hip joints, surgical meshes. We've seen that the regulators have just moved recently against surgical meshes. Europe decided they had to have a wholesale change of the medical device regulations. It had been brewing for a long time, but then these events really kick-started it. And two fundamental things changed. The regulations were changed to bring in more governance, more supervision of notified bodies. And we're not going to talk about all of that in great detail, but the point is that what it's done is it's going to reduce dramatically the number of notified bodies practicing and increase the requirements of supervision on those notified bodies. So there will be fewer of them. They've got to do a whole lot more. And guess what that means? It's going to take more time and cost a whole lot more money for you, the manufacturer, in gaining approvals in Europe. And the failures of the implantable devices mean that there's now expectations of far more clinical data. And again, we'll look at that in a little bit more detail later, but that's changed completely as well. So here's the implementation of MDR. This is Neil McAleenan, who's a senior member of the Irish Competent Authority, and he was speaking in China a couple of years ago about this whole process of implementing the medical device regulations, and particularly here the designation of notified bodies, because what's happening is all of those notified bodies have got to be redesignated. They've got to reapply for their jobs. There's no grandfathering here, and every one of them's got to be reapproved through this designation process. And back then, Neil was saying this is an estimated end-to-end process of about 18 months. The problem is they still haven't got there. 18 months was expected to take. It is, if you look at this slide in detail, May 2019 is the possible first designation proposal going to the Medical Device Coordination Group in Brussels. So they are still on track, but it's not leaving a lot of time because the full application of the regulations is in May next year, 2020. In other words, there are 13 months to go. We see that now, because there are fewer notified bodies and because everybody's got to reapply, and there's no grandfathering of registrations either, so every single device has got to be reapproved, recertified. We're seeing now, as Gert Boss and QServe said a little while ago, the waiting lists of some notified bodies are now running up to 12 to 14 months. 12 to 14 months with 13 months to go, whilst others are becoming far more selective in the type of clients and scope of the product. So if you haven't already engaged a notified body, you're not going to make the cutoff at this point. Just last week, on the 15th of April, MedTech Europe, the industry association in Europe, wrote an open letter, this open letter here, to the Commission saying, and I quote, "The industry is prepared to submit product files to comply with the new regulations. However, we can't do so because the system is not ready to function. There are no designated notified bodies. The big database, the EUEMA database on which it's all meant to work, is not yet completed. So it's going to be some interesting times here. Something's got to give." So that's what's going on. Here's Eric Vollebrecht from Axon Lawyers a few months ago saying there's also the question of Brexit. Without the agreement that the United Kingdom stays connected to Europe in some manner, like Switzerland. So there are some countries who are not part of the European Union. Switzerland is one. Norway is another. They have other treaties like the Free Trade Association, and Switzerland has a mutual recognition agreement with Europe which recognizes the CE marking process and allows it to participate in that, so that you can have a notified body and a competent authority in Switzerland, even though it's not formally part of the European Union. They're part of the system. If the United Kingdom doesn't do that, and particularly if there's a no-deal Brexit, in other words, they crash out of the European Union without a formal treaty, then they'll no longer be able to have notified bodies, and the competent authority in the United Kingdom, the MHRA, will no longer be part of the system. And that's a big problem because the MHRA is one of the leading competent authorities. It's provided a lot of the intellectual horsepower and expertise in driving the system, and if it disappears, that's a problem for Europe. And the notified bodies. Here's some very interesting statistics that came out of BSI, who pointed out that of all the devices which are CE marked, these are the proportions which are actually CE marked by the 4 British notified bodies. In other words, the UK notified bodies account for half of the CE marking activity. Half of the approvals in Europe were actually done by notified bodies domiciled in England. That's SGS, LRQA, BSI, and UL, who have their head offices in the UK. And those 4 notified bodies account for half of all devices sold in Europe and account for 70% of all devices imported into Europe. And with Brexit, those 4 notified bodies no longer can function. So there's a big hole in the capacity there. They're busily trying to change. BSI has set up a Netherlands notified body, BSI Netherlands. SGS has got notified bodies in a couple of other countries. UL, we're not quite sure what they're doing, and LRQA are in process of setting up a Netherlands notified body, but they've said it's going to be at least the end of this year before that one is ready to operate. So we've got a big loss of capacity. Now, the problem is that the CE mark, because it was so popular back 8-9 years ago, many other regulatory authorities recognized it as a sort of global passport. So it's a bit like when you're in the crowd at the airport and you've got your CE certificate and you go through the fast track and don't have to queue up and go through the whole registration and check-in process like everybody else. And here in the Asia Pacific are just some examples of that. So Singapore has expedited pathways for devices which are supported by CE marking and by other GHTF founder member approvals. So if you've got an approval from one of those bodies, Singapore will expedite your regulation. Taiwan, if you've got both a European and a US approval, then you can get Class 2 devices, which are the bulk of devices in Taiwan. They have a 3-tier classification system. Class 2 devices can be expedited in their review if you can present a CE certificate and the US approval. Saudi Arabia has a whole system predicated on verification of a GHTF member approval, and you have to pick one, and most people choose the CE, and you can present your CE, and they have a system which verifies the CE approval and does a small technical review for high-risk devices. Malaysia has a very similar system where they also review the CE approval and they do a technical audit. And here in Australia, TGA has been accepting CE mark for a long time because the Australian system is essentially very closely aligned with the European. And more recently, they've been looking at other jurisdictions. So let's just look particularly at the Australian example. It's one we know well. Obviously, we're here in Sydney, but it's a really good example. So in Australia, TGA says, well, you can go through a TGA conformity assessment, which is exactly like going to a notified body in Europe. And then when you've done that, you can register any devices covered by that assessment and go to the Australian market. Or, since the CE process is essentially identical, TGA will accept a European CE mark in lieu of their own certificate and through a very short registration process and go straight to market. For most devices, that's a very quick process that takes just a few weeks. And then for higher risk devices, TGA do a second review, a desktop review of key documents. And here's the statistics. Something like more than 90%, some people say it's more than 95, but it's certainly more than 90% of devices which require pre-market registration and review. This doesn't include class 1 devices, but 90% of everything from class 1 sterile upwards are registered in Australia, not based on a primary TGA review, but based on a prior CE certification. Now, with those CE certificates becoming harder to get, that creates problems for jurisdictions like Australia.
And just a question, Arthur, on that. With the 90% that have already got a CE mark based on the MDD, how do we see the transition to MDR?
So TGA at least is being pretty pragmatic about that. So they recognize things are taking a while. They also recognize the challenge of Brexit. So TGA have said that they will continue to recognize certificates issued by British notified bodies, even if there is a Brexit with no deal. They'll allow those certificates to continue to be recognised for their full validity, and giving manufacturers the time to transition over to the MDR. And that's also going to be the case with MDD certificates. TGA will continue. So they've been pretty sensible about this. So there will be a transitional arrangement, and they will allow the Europeans to sort themselves out, but it's going to take some time. TGA might be waiting for quite a while, but that's what's going on at the moment. The other thing that TGA are doing is really interesting. So this is a slide showing the current system. So device classifications on the left in increasing order of risk going up the chart, and you can bring a CE certificate to TGA, and that will get you an application approved and a registration on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. And TGA do an application audit, and those application audits tend to be weighted towards the high-risk devices. They are mandatory for all Class 3 and active implants. They're mandatory for certain Class 2B devices, and they're optional. The regulator can choose to audit anything else. In reality, that's fairly rare. There's only a couple of % of the others get audited. But they do all of the high-risk ones. And TGA considers the CE certificate to be two things. It's both a product assessment, the CE certificate requires a review of technical data by the notified body, and it's also a quality systems assessment. You can't get a CE without having had a quality systems audit. So TGA's view is that is two things. But now there's recently, as of I think a few months ago now, August or so, they now allow manufacturers to bring evidence from other jurisdictions. So it's still got to be both. It's got to be both a product assessment, which can be any of these things. It can be a US pre-market approval or 510K clearance. It can be a Canadian medical device license. It can be a Japanese Shonin or Ninsho approvals. Notice that the classes align. So if you've got a Class 3 device in Australia, Australian Class 3 device, then you need to have either a Canadian Level 4 license, Class 4 license, or Japanese Shonin, or a pre-market approval from the United States. So it doesn't work for all Class 3 devices, and because quite a number of Class 3 devices, for example, are subject to 510K in the US, and TGA won't accept a 510K to support Class 3. The second thing you need is a quality system certificate, and for that TGA will accept either an MDSAP certificate or a Japanese quality management certificate. And for Class 1 sterile or measuring, there is no product assessment required. They'll take you can just bring the MDSAP certificate to register those devices. So it's interesting, TGA are not requiring MDSAP, but under this new way of doing things, they're certainly putting their weight behind the whole idea of the MDSAP program, and they're recognizing it formally. And they're the second jurisdiction really to do that. There are others that recognize it. Japan and the US particularly, and Brazil also recognize MDSAP.
Just wanted to add, Arthur, briefly, with the changes with the MDR, obviously there's some changes in classifications that are occurring in Europe. With a focus here on Australia, we're also seeing a huge number of consultations being published by the Australian regulator, looking for industry to comment around the impact of those particular classification changes, and actually looking to incorporate some of those changes. So for people listening to this, if they haven't yet had an opportunity to look at those consultations, strongly suggest it's worth looking at the TGA website. There's a huge number of changes sort of looking to come down into the future.
We have an election going on here, so TGA were getting those consultations out before the election, because during the election nobody can actually formally do anything. But there's a lot of, as you say, a lot there. Go to the TGA website, tga.gov.au, and look for medical device consultations. And what they're doing is they are quite proactively changing the classification system here, which is currently aligned with the Medical Device Directive, and they're looking to realign it with the new classification system that's in the Medical Device Regulations. And a number of other jurisdictions are looking at that as well. I was with the Asian Harmonization Working Party meeting in Riyadh a couple of weeks ago, and that organization is again looking at their guidances on classifications of things and whether there needs to be realignment. So that's going on. So, meanwhile, what's going on in the United States? This is Bill Sutton. Bill is head of the FDA in China. The FDA actually has an office in China, and Bill heads up that office. And here is Bill talking at the same conference that I was showing the slide of Neil McLennan before, the CIMDR conference in Hangzhou a couple of years ago. And he was making the point that things are improving dramatically in the US, that approval times are getting quicker. Here we have the chart behind him of average total time for a pre-market assessment, which is the high-risk process, but the same's going on in 510Ks. Things are getting better in the US. Things are being streamlined. Let's look at some of the changes that are going on in the FDA. Firstly, there's some quite interesting proposals to update the 510K program. The de novo program has been around for a little while now, and since a couple of years ago, FDA removed the requirement for you to at least try for a standard 510K and fail that first. You can now go direct to a de novo. This is where you come forward with a medical device for which there is no existing regulatory classification in the United States, which therefore makes it automatically Class 3. Every new technology goes into the Class 3. You can go to FDA and say, we believe this is not a Class 3, it's a lower risk device, and we petition for a classification as a Class 2 device at the same time as provide you with regulatory data. And the regulatory data are the primary design verification testing and the clinical evidence, as well as a parallel petition for reclassification. That looks awfully like conformity assessment. It's exactly what's going on in Europe. The FDA is now looking to expand that idea into the conventional, traditional 510K by making noises about having a way of doing submissions for lower risk devices where there's no need to longer to compare to a predicate device. They simply look at it based on compliance with consensus technical standards. Do the devices meet the current consensus product standards? That's the way FDA will look at it. And again, that's the way Class 2A medical devices dealt with in the rest of the world. So here we have the FDA looking to adjust their 510K programs for the medium risk devices. The bulk of applications in the US go through the 510K process, and it's starting to again align more with what goes on in the rest of the world. They're doing a very interesting trial at the moment on software as a medical device, using a thing called the pre-certification program. That's based around manufacturer competence. We'll look at that again in the next slide in a bit more detail. There's also an intent flagged a little while ago by the FDA to migrate from their own quality systems regulations to auditing to ISO 13485. That's a very significant change, because the FDA audit process, although the quality systems regulations are quite well aligned with ISO 13485, the process, the way FDA conducts an audit is quite different. But they're now going to move over to ISO 13485. They signal their intent to do that this year. So there is now an emerging global consensus on the one standard to do medical devices auditing. So we're now sort of getting to the point where the pharmaceutical industry has been for some time. So we're seeing some technical convergences here. This is a slide from a blog I wrote a couple of months ago. You can go and read this. I wrote it last November. I called it Harmonization in Plain Sight, Are FDA and Europe Substantially Equivalent? Now, I quickly say I wrote this blog with my tongue firmly in my cheek. They're not substantially equivalent, but my point is they are becoming more and more the same, and there's a lot going on. The de novo process itself looks particularly like the sort of kind of reviews you do for higher risk medical devices in Europe, and the changes to the 510K are looking at the kinds of conformity assessments you'd see for lower risk medical devices in Europe and Canada and other places. But what we're seeing here is increasing emphasis on clinical evidence by FDA, particularly in the de novo submissions where it's the rule. And more traditional 510Ks have clinical data. We're seeing the Europeans are now bringing in the concept of predicate devices and equivalents into their clinical evaluation process. So the European clinical guidance, the MedDev 2.7/1 version 4, the big document on how to do clinical evaluation, has a part in it which talks about doing predicate comparisons, comparing your device to others in the marketplace. And we're seeing convergence on quality systems with 13485 becoming the global standard. And we're seeing consensus, mainly primary ISO documents, which are either republished as European standards or used as they are, as the technical basis for regulation everywhere. So we're seeing technical convergence as the basis for regulation. And here's that FDA pre-cert program. This graphic is off the FDA website. And basically, this graphic is how they want it to look in the future. It's not how it is now. There's a pilot program going on. But what they're trying to work towards is a sort of life cycle approach where the reviews are as much about the competence of the manufacturer in yellow as they are about the review of the device in blue. So the idea is there will be an assessment of the manufacturer in terms of their culture of quality and organizational excellence, is the way the FDA puts it, but it's basically a quality systems review. Does the manufacturer have control over the production of software? And this is recognizing that software iterates very rapidly, and really the 510K model is just too cumbersome to cope with multiple reviews of software, which go on quite quickly. And so what they're looking to do is to pre-certify manufacturers as competent to manage that themselves. And then there will be initial reviews which define the product claims for particular sets of software, and providing you stay within those claims, you can then update the software as you go along, and FDA will come and retrospectively review those updates the next time they come and do an audit. This is also starting to look like conformity assessment. And so what the FDA are saying, this is a direct quote from the same webpage, potentially pre-certified companies could market their lower risk devices without FDA pre-market review, or only a streamlined pre-market review based on the company's pre-certification level and the risk categorization of the software. So that's a very interesting change, and what FDA have already said they intend to take this to SIMD, software in a medical device. In other words, devices which are software driven, which is quite a large proportion of devices these days, and who knows where it will go from there. This is really a real shift in FDA. So how does this all work? We now come to how do you deal with this in regulatory practice? Grant, what do you do?
Thanks, Arthur. So, look, I mean, fundamentally, your technical file. I think one of the things that we're having discussions with clients around is ensuring your technical file is set up in such a structure that you can actually adapt it across multiple jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. So what you should be able to do is sort of piecemeal it, right? Mm-hmm. So taking information out, looking at different dossiers that you need to prepare and submit for across a global market. Right. Again, being able to do that does actually allow you then to grab various pieces of that technical file to help develop in those submissions and those regulatory submissions that you're going to do.
The pharmaceutical industry has been doing this for years.
Correct. Absolutely.
One core source of truth.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And the technical file's been around in Europe for a while, but I don't think it's been quite seen as that by a lot of companies.
Absolutely.
And when they're dealing with a different system in the US.
Correct. And I mean, we're absolutely seeing that now. Yeah. You know, we're starting to see companies recognizing that this needs to be sorted, this needs to be tidied up. So as much as we talk about the pendulum swinging from one extreme to the other, I think some are certainly saying that, you know, it's about time that a lot of this stuff has started to be rectified.
And I think the ISO 13485 latest version, the 2016, gets into this specifically and talks about having a technical file. And I don't know if it uses that particular language, but it's very much more explicit that there shall be a core set of documentation that's maintained.
Absolutely. And clinical evidence. Clinical evidence is becoming such a big part of.
Yeah,
all right. Post-market, gathering the data, monitoring your trends, and acting. To your point, pharma has been doing this for a long time through pharmacovigilance. The intent has always been there across multiple regulatory agencies. It's already, you know, it's been there in the past for many years. It has been a little bit loose in how that's been controlled. Yeah. I think the MDR is going to really enforce this, you know, and push manufacturers to really start ensuring their post-market vigilance is really up to spec. And it's going to be a challenge into the future without a
I think that's really one of the hallmarks of the new MDR, isn't it? That there are now formal processes for post-market clinical follow-up, post-market reporting, and all going into that public database.
Yep.
It's no longer something that's just nominally there in the background. It's a proactive central part of the regulatory framework.
Correct. And I think this is where people are starting to recognise what this is going to do internally from a resource perspective. You know, I think it was last year in the US, I saw someone present that basically said, you know, if you haven't, you know, at least doubled your budget, doubled your resources in preparation for MDR, you're going to really struggle.
Sure.
And I think there's certainly some...
One of the things we say there is act on this. I often come across manufacturers who've got a post-market issue brewing away, and their instinct is to hope that nobody notices. Is that a good idea?
We've seen cases that's not a good idea.
The point I'm making here is if you've got an issue brewing up, you better be active about it, because the regulator will find out. And if you're not on top of that at the time they come knocking on the door, then you're exposed.
Yeah.
You want to be ahead of the curve. You want to be acting on this. And so proactive post-market is really going to be very much the name of the game.
Correct. And we're seeing more and more regulators communicating internally. So something triggers in Europe or something triggers in the US, generally, you know, someone like the TGA is going to also knock on your sponsor's door.
Hey, guess what? Regulators talk to each other.
Yeah. No one's figured that out yet.
Okay.
And regulatory intelligence. I think moving forward, understanding and keeping up to speed with standards is absolutely critical. So most regulatory agencies talk about state of the art. Absolutely imperative.
And that state of the art is what? It's compliance with current consensus standards. That's how it's defined.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So absolutely.
So you need to. So monitoring what's going on, and that's easy these days. You can sign up to free monitoring services just to keep an eye on what's going on with your current standards.
Changing requirements. You know, keeping ahead of what's happening. So similar to what I alluded to earlier on. Excuse me. TGA is putting out a truckload of consultation papers. Being ahead of that curve, looking at what the TGA is thinking and thinking about implementing, and also sort of staying that ahead of
bringing it back into your technical file.
Correct, and bringing it back into your technical file. Absolutely. And again, as those changes occur, you need to act on those changes. You know, you can't necessarily play the ignorance card and get away with it. So it's necessary to stay ahead.
And that needs to be global.
Absolutely.
It needs to be global. Okay. You said before clinical evidence is paramount. I just wanted to return to that. This little diagram here, those points around the cloud there, they are the key components of a clinical evidence report as defined in the new European MedDev clinical evidence guidance, the so-called 2.7/1 version 4 MedDev guidance. It's a big book of a thing, 65 pages long, and it talks about how to compile clinical evidence. And the point I want to make here is if you look at that list, that contents list, it really constitutes a review of the whole technical file. What the clinical evidence report is becoming is the high-level review of everything you have done to demonstrate that that device is safe and will perform as intended in the hands of the user. So you're going back, you're actually expected to look at your risk assessment. You're expected to look at preclinical data, testing. You're expected to look at predicate comparisons, review the literature. You're meant to look at whether you've got direct clinical trials data. And then what about clinical studies? What about post-market data? And what about active post-market clinical follow-up? Again, as we were just saying, this is becoming very real in the new European regulations. The pharma industry's been doing it forever. It's now front and center of the new European requirements. And if you're not active about it, then the regulator certainly is going to be active about it. Now, the orthopedics industry has been aware of this it's probably ahead of everybody on this because in orthopedics, we have very well-established device registries. There's a well-known one here in Australia. There are others in Europe and the United States. And this little chart here is an example of the thing you see where registries collect information on devices going in and when they fail, when they're revised, when they're taken out again, and they can produce survivorship curves like this. And if your device is the one on the top green line and all other devices are the blue line below, and your device is being revised, is failing at a higher rate, then you better have a good explanation for that. Because guess what? The regulators are reading the same reports from the registries, and there's a long-term follow-up. And certainly the orthopedics industry has become very good at following this now and understanding what's going on with their devices. It's systematic. Clinical evidence is now paramount. It's the central part of the regulatory file, and it's the document that pulls everything else together. And I can't emphasize that enough. That's really what it's all about. What about this, though?
How to survive it.
The real commercial stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, this is all regulatory practice, but how do you turn this into commercial practice?
Yeah. So I think one of the key things for all organisations that are going through this need to understand the strategy. What is the plan? It is absolutely imperative that the regulatory guys or the regulatory teams understand what sales and marketing need to do, or what they're aiming to do, and I think it's ensure that aligns with their regulatory strategies. There's no point having sales and marketing budget, with revenue turning in the next 6 months, if realistically MDR is going to impact me and not be able to start to really commercialise for another 12 months. So it's ensuring that the regulatory team is involved in all of those early stage discussions. Make sure it's very clear as to what the goals are.
It's the art of the possible.
Absolutely, art of the possible, right? So this really comes down to what is the strategy. It's understanding, and I think going back to some of our earlier slides, it's absolutely imperative that you're ahead of the curve. You understand what's coming. Again, regulation changes. Now, if your goal is to be commercialising in the next 6 months, however, there's a regulatory change in the next 6 to 12 months, you want to know that now. You don't want to know that at the
just before product launch.
Correct, right? That's an uncomfortable discussion to be having with the CEO or with the head of sales and marketing, right? So you want to be able to absolutely stay ahead of that curve. What is really critical here is communication. So make sure everybody's aligned internally and know what's going on, including customers. I think it's imperative that these things need to be completely communicated. And also your investors. It's very critical that investors understand what's happening within the business from a commercial sense and trying to get product to market. That's really going to save a lot of headaches into the long run. So I guess fundamentally, just stay ahead of the game, understand what's happening, understand what's coming, which is just as important.
But we're regulatory geeks. We like to look at the rules and the regulations. We're not communicators. You mean we've got to go and talk to those other people?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all of what it's about, isn't it?
It is.
Both internal and external. And I must say that the most effective way of doing this, and the most effective teams I've seen, is where sales and marketing, sales particularly, is closely related and talking to regulatory, and the two are supporting each other.
Correct.
So sales needs to be communicating with regulatory early about their long-term plans, and regulatory needs to be in those discussions about the art of the possible, about what's going to be required, so that the two work hand in hand. And when that happens, you get magic. Things really do go properly. Whereas what happens, unfortunately, all too often is sales have a new idea. We've got to get this new product in the market because we've got customers suddenly say they want it, and can we have it in 3 weeks' time? And the answer is no, it's going to be 2 years. So it's all about making sure those communications.
And to your point, and just to, I guess, emphasize that, it's now becoming a team. All right. It's, if I look back, 10 years ago plus, it was about sales and what sales wanted, and then that was what was there. Now it really is, you need to be embedded in that team. You need to understand what the plans are. And I think just as importantly, regulatory needs to be well connected.
Yes.
All right. So the regulatory team need to be connected into the sales and marketing divisions. They also need to be connected to people outside of that, right? So think about the regulatory agencies. Think about your consultants that you're using. Make sure that they are tapped into your business so they can actually advise you on, this is what's coming, this is what's going to change. If you don't have those connections, there's something wrong. There's a chance that you're going to miss it as it comes down the pipeline. So I think that's absolutely imperative.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So I think we've talked long enough. Let's have some questions and Q&A.
All right. So Anna, this comes out of Singapore.
This is Anna.
Anna has a US supplier of medical devices. Has a UK notified body. Is there anything they need to be concerned about?
Very much so. I hope, Anna, that you're talking to your United Kingdom notified body and asking them very direct questions about what arrangements they've got in place for Brexit. Assuming that it goes forward, what they're doing now. As I said, there are 4 United Kingdom notified bodies. From the public pronouncements, they're quite different. BSI has actually set up and announced that it's got BSI Netherlands in place. SGS has announced and said it's got 2 other notified bodies domiciled in 2 other countries in Europe. One's in Germany. I think I've forgotten where the other one is, but they've got 2 already. And both SGS and BSI have announced that they have administrative processes in place to simply transfer the files from one notified body to another, and they've verified with the competent authorities that that's acceptable. So there's no need for a re-review. They can take the review that's done by the British notified body and transfer the file straight to the European one and carry on. So those 2 organizations at least have got the plans in place. LRQA has said that they're going down that road, but they're a little bit further behind. They've said it's going to be late this year, but having said that, it looks like everybody's going to be late this year before they get something set up. And then I'm not quite sure what UL are doing. Their public website just says that they're committed to working with stakeholders or something like that. But I'm sure that UL have got plans as well, and they will be talking to their customers. And so Anna, talk to your notified body. Don't ask me anymore. Go talk to them directly if you haven't already done so, and ask them quite directly what is the arrangements for continued service. Yeah. And particularly ask them what is going to be the scope of your designation, because every notified body has got to be redesignated, and some of them are changing their scope. A notified body can only review and certify devices within the scope of its approval. So if the notified body is deciding to reduce the range of technologies which it's going to be designated to review, are you still going to be within that range? Ask that specific question.
And just to add to that, Arthur, one of the key points here, and it goes back to my slide that we just moved on from, it's understanding the impact that's going to have. So thinking about other jurisdictions that you're looking at entering, at the moment they've got approval to provide your CE certificates. Think about outside of that and think about if you want to go into other markets, MDSAP and those sorts of things, do they have the ability to do that? So you need to be asking those questions early.
Mm-hmm.
I've got another question here from Carl out of Germany. He's heard that MDSAP is expensive, and I think we can certainly talk to this. He heard that it's expensive and difficult. Is it worth it?
Yeah. Well, when it first started off, it was certainly true. But I think there's been some adjustments to the MDSAP program because one of the complications of the MDSAP is that if you choose to have a medical device single audit program, what MDSAP does is it's a 13485 audit plus. It's a 13485 audit plus an explicit review of your processes and evidence for compliance with regulations. And in all of the MDSAP markets, participating markets that you serve. So MDSAP is currently a program between the US, Australia, Japan, Brazil, and Canada. Okay, it's not actually, Europe is not actually signed on to MDSAP just yet, but they use a very similar system. So if you are marketing in all of those places, then your MDSAP audit has to review your compliance arrangements in all of those places. You can't pick and choose. If you're supplying in a market, you have to be audited against it. So that can extend the audit because of more to look at, and it can get expensive. Having said that, it's a single audit. I once heard that Medtronic, one of the world's biggest medical device companies, gets audited every 18 days by somebody because every regulator's coming to look at them. The whole point of MDSAP is it's a common practice and you get audited once and all the regulators sign on to it. So that saves you a whole lot of grief because the big cost of an audit is not the audit fee, it's all of the time spent supporting the auditors. But it is expensive, but it's getting less so because they're managing to constrain the audits a bit more now. They're tuning them. The Canadians did that in response to a lot of complaints from their domestic small companies who had to go through MDSAP. And it's getting easier.
Yeah.
And is it worth it? I think if you're in multiple markets, yes. It's quite interesting in Australia where we're a small country with a small market and all of our domestic manufacturers see themselves as global companies. They have to be. They have to export to build a sustainable business, and MDSAP has been very popular here. The local smaller players are signing on to MDSAP because it gives them access to multiple markets. I see Elisabetta sent in a question in advance. By the way, for future webinars, we do, if you register, you can put a question in advance. Elisabetta from Italy said she's got a particular interest in the Brexit and MDSAP and how MDSAP is recognized in other countries. That's a good question. Are we seeing any? I don't think we're yet seeing any of these smaller jurisdictions recognizing MDSAP, but there's certainly going to be an interest in it.
I think as it moves forward, absolutely, we'll definitely see more and more countries, and I think it's becoming more so considering MDR. So as those countries that have relied on CE in the past have to find alternative pathways if they still want to attract new technologies. Yes. So one of the key points there is I think we are going to see more and more countries coming online with MDSAP and accepting those to be able to get that new technology in.
Indeed.
I've got a question here from John. He's doing all of this for the first time. Understands the idea of a technical file, but what about all those other design dossiers or all of the other necessary documents?
Right, yeah. Well, look, the technical file is the core, as I said. The key part of all of this is having one core source of truth, and you can then develop from that the design dossier, which is a document of full verification and clinical data, which is reviewed in full by a regulatory authority for high-risk devices. You can develop the design history file and bring that into your technical file. But we're going to talk about all of that next time, in fact, the next webinar. So I'll come back to that in a moment and give you the details of that. But let's just have a look at some of the other questions. We got one from Ashley who was sent in advance, which Ashley says, what about factoring in the cost of change and how do businesses adapt? She says that's more a theme than a question, but Ashley, thank you for that from the United Kingdom. It is expensive. And again, that's where you need to be in these internal communications, that this has to go into the budget. The sales budget and the product development budgets have to factor in the cost of all of these. It's certainly it's a fact of life that things are getting a whole lot more time consuming and a whole lot more expensive. We have some questions here from Romit. Have we used a Japanese quality system certificate as an evidence for an ARTG entry? If so, was the entire Japanese translated into English, the certificate, and submit the entire supplementary document which comes from the Japan QMS certificate, or only relevant pages? That's a detailed question. The TGA are still grappling with this. They are doing it. We're actually looking at doing one of these at the moment. And the answer is primarily it will depend on the risk classification of the device. So if it's a high-risk one, TGA is going to be doing application audits, and they will want the documentation in English. So if you've got a high-risk device coming in that way, they are going to do an application audit. They are going to want to see the clinical evidence report. They are going to want to see a risk management report, and all of that will have to go into English. If it's a low-risk device, a Class 2A, then they'll just want the certificate translating into English and providing, and then they can verify that with the Japanese regulator. And then Romad also asks, is there an equivalent of MedDev 2.7.1 revision when MDR comes into effect? Well, we're on version 4 now. I remember a conversation with Basil Akra from Tulsud, who was very active in the writing of that MedDev, and he said the plan is there will be future revisions. The version 4 that we're dealing with at the moment is really a transitional version. It's setting up the extra requirements as preparation for what's going on, but we expect to see version 5 as the MDR comes in future.
All right. Paul, good morning. So Paul represents an Australian innovator looking to commercialise in Australia, EU and the US. The traditional route was to obtain CE using notified body in Europe, then come back to Australia. Understands that a TGA conformity assessment is not transferable to the EU.
That's correct. It is possible. A TGA is currently under a mutual recognition agreement able to do assessments against the medical device directives. I don't believe that I don't know whether TGA will continue to do that under the medical device regulations. I suspect they won't. But you're right, Paul, you can't use an ordinary TGA conformity assessment certificate in Europe. You can pay to TGA to do a CE certification against MDD. But that's rare these days. There are a small number of Australian manufacturers that do that. But we are seeing some manufacturers for whom Australia represents a good enough market electing to go to a direct TGA conformity assessment in parallel to a CE assessment, even though they're effectively paying twice. They're electing to do that just because they can get market access in Australia sooner than is possible currently in Europe.
I think we've probably got time for one more, and I want to come to Tina's question. So any suggestions for a leadership team who think that the regulatory staff are crying wolf and that the MDR changes are being blown out of proportion or are somehow optional?
Well,
thank you, Tina. That's look, I mean, it's a challenge that we're seeing in a lot of different places, and certainly my travels primarily through the US. It's starting to become real, and realistically, there's really no way to convince. I think as you're having discussions with your leadership team, it's having that evidence, having that case in front of them.
I think one good example. Notified body waiting times are now 12 to 14 months, with 13 months to go to the transition period, and they aren't able to do any assessments yet either. So there's clearly something broken in the European transition, and that's going to take some time to sort out. And there's at the moment no mechanism for extension. There's got to be some regulatory change to extend that. And the post-market clinical follow-up. The point is, point them to what's planned for Eudamed. I think that's a really good example. Show your management team what the European regulations require in terms of the Eudamed database, and the fact that you will have to produce regular post-market clinical follow-up reports, that they go into the database and that they become public documents. And so you're going to need to do that properly because it's going to be in the public domain. Those sorts of things. Just understand that this is now regulation of devices in the same way that drugs have been regulated.
Yeah. And I think, just to add to that, Arthur, for everybody, when you're having that discussion, make it very clear what the potential outcome is here, right? So we can put in front of senior leadership teams all of the graphs, all of the data that we've got. I mean, there are so many articles out there from so many different sources. I think fundamentally, when you put it down on paper in front of the leadership team and say, come X date, if we have not got this sorted, you are not going to be able to sell. And that's really what it's going to have to come. No grandfathering. There's no grandfathering. This is it. This is crunch time. Yeah. And as hard as that is, it's not an easy discussion to have. This is where regulatory really needs to step up and make it absolutely clear that this is what's coming. This is, well, realistically, as Arthur said in our very initial slide, we're in the heart of the storm, right? So right now, we're in the brunt of it. And if things haven't been triggered or aren't triggered, immediately, there is absolutely going to be a flow-on effect.
Indeed. Good question, though. Thank you, Gina.
Yeah, thanks,
okay, I think we'll draw it to a close at that point. I just want to make the point about our next webinar. Here's what we're doing next month on the 22nd of May, if you're in the US, 23rd in Australia. It'll be 22nd late in the day in Europe. So we're calling it Documentation Deconstructed, understanding the technical file. So we've today talked about the core role of a proper technical file as the foundation for all of this new world of a heightened level of compliance. And good documentation is about doing it once. So we're going to look at how the design controls can be used to build a core technical file, and create a design history file, a device master record, a design dossier, and to extract from that technical file regulatory filings such as a 510K or a PMA. How does this all fit together? So that's what we're going to be looking at 22nd of May, 23rd of May, depending on where you are. So look forward to having you all join us again there. Thank you for being such a good audience. Thank you, Grant, for participating in this. You can follow us if you've enjoyed this. You can follow us, look at our website. You can follow me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and on our YouTube channel, where the recording of this webinar will be posted in a little while. If you're registered here, you will also receive an email follow-up from us shortly with a copy of the slides and a link to the video of the webinar.
Yep.
So from that,
I think we're all done. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy what's left of your day.
Thank you. Good morning.